G'day. Today we're going to be making some cobblestone walls that you can use for wargaming, for a road setting for a Dungeons and Dragons style adventure, or even just as a diorama piece. So I'm starting off with some 5mm foam core. I'm marking out some segments that I think will be long enough for the walls. I'm using a sharp hobby knife to just cut right through that foam core. It doesn't need to be exactly precise. Good. Now I've covered a cutting mat in cling film, just to keep it from getting too covered in clay. The clay I'm using is just a terracotta style clay. It's an air drying one. I start off by getting a clump I think is going to be enough to roll into a flat that'll cover the entire wall, the foam core segment that I've cut out. After rolling it pretty flat, I check to make sure that it's going to actually fit over the entire wall. Now this is my stone roller. I made this out of some clay, which I then imprinted some small actual stones into and let air dry so that I can use it to roll the same texture onto other clay. I squish a small piece of clay onto the wall and begin rolling. Now it's always better to just go across in one smooth motion, but I had to go back and forth a few times to get the detail I wanted. So I'll work on this one side at a time. But I do need to kind of join all the pieces of clay at once, so I can't really wait for it to dry. Otherwise it won't stick to itself as easily. I scrape away the excess clay at the bottom and at the top and the sides so that I can then join pieces on. For the other sides, I need to roll out the texture first. Because I've got the texture on one side, pressing it into the table will just flatten everything. So I've cut a section that I think will be just about the right size. Doesn't have to be too precise, because clay is fairly flexible. Now I've spread the back of this piece of foam core with some PVA glue, as I'm doing just here, just to help it adhere a bit better. And if a bit of the glue spills, it's not really a problem, because it's just air drying as well, and it'll all set nicely. I do the same process for the top with a small piece. Now the top is a little bit different in that I need to fold the edge over. So you'll see in a moment that when I do that, I start by pressing it down with my fingers. Now that leaves a bit of a lip, which I don't really want. So I'll have to find some way of squishing it in. So I've decided to use a rock, just one that I found in the backyard, to just squish that clay together. It gets that same sort of rocky texture going and makes it a much smoother join. Now, this wasn't the best way to do it, I've found. An easier way I'll show later, which is to actually use a pencil to just freehand join everything together. This rock, however, does allow me to get in the creases of all of the stones and start really highlighting that detail a little bit more. So you see how that's mostly joined at the moment? Now I'm going to use a pencil and I'm just going to very lightly dab in without squishing the detail in the back of the piece. So I blend in the details together, and I do the same thing on the other side. I start with the rock to get a rough surface. And you can see how that pencil is just making that seam disappear. I alternate between the eraser on the pencil and the tip just to get a different size point and to different smoothness. I'll then go around a lot of the rocks in the gaps just to try and bring out those rocks a bit more, because on the top you'd have more weathering and so the water would have eroded some of the mortar or whatever. Just adding a bit of dab of PVA glue to my work surface there, just so I can dab it on with my finger, because I don't really want to touch the piece too much while it's drying, and risk destroying the detail with my fingers. Now it's important to use a sharp knife for this bit, otherwise you're going to end up ripping the clay in places that you don't want it to be ripped. So, after repeating that process for the other side and letting it air dry overnight, you can see it's turned out pretty well. That small gap I was just pointing at is where I've rolled back over the clay with the roller, and it's sort of squished two folds together. Now that's not a huge problem, but it is something I will be trying to cover up later. But for now I'm going to start by making a bit of a base, because it's not particularly stable. So I just get a small piece of cardstock, and I don't worry too much about the actual shape, but I'll hot glue the wall to the card, just so it's got a nice strong bond, and it gives me something to work with when I want to decorate the base. After letting that dry for a little while, I get out my small container of rocks. I choose a couple of large rocks that might be interesting to add on the base. I don't worry too much about getting it exact at this point. Just choose a few rocks that seem like they might be fun. So at the moment I'm just sort of playing around with where I could actually stick these rocks. That would actually make sense. Maybe a rock has fallen off, maybe there's a bit of a milestone marker, which this one turns into. Maybe there's a bit of chipped off stone from when someone was trying to fit a rock. It's all about a bit of a story that you kind of develop as you build the piece. What happened to make this wall? This one here is a milestone marker I decided on. It's a nice flat stone someone could easily carve into. Now I'm just refining the shape of the base to something that's a little bit more manageable and isn't quite so large. Something that will still provide the same amount of stability without being too hard to work with. I'm cutting fairly close to the wall at this point, but I'm leaving that little lip bit on the edge, just so that I've got something for the rocks and other things to adhere to. It doesn't matter if any of the cardboard rips or anything on the bottom, because no one's going to see that anyway. Now I'm just applying a thin layer of PVA glue. I'm making sure it gets right into that crease just next to the wall, just between the wall and the cardboard. Now it's important with this to work in small sections because the PVA glue has a pretty high surface tension, and so it tends to clump into the recesses very, very well, and I'd like it to stay on the flat if at all possible, so I need to work a bit quickly. So that's why I'm working in sections on this wall. I'll apply PVA glue to one section, and then I'll add some basing material. Now you can add whatever basing material you'd like, but for me I chose to use some small rocks and a few other little things just to add a bit of interest. It's a good base for just about any environment. So say this was in a fairly temperate climate, you'd have some rocks, you'd have some grass, things like that. But having a few of the larger ones around is really good. And then I've used a few smaller ones as well, just to add a bit of variation and make it seem less uniform. So I've decided to add some foliage of some kind. This is a bit of roots and something from my back garden. Not entirely sure what plant it came from, but it was dug up in last year's harvest of the greenhouse. And so I'm just picking out a couple of sections that I think might look really good as like a tree stump or small tree or something growing. So I'll use again a sharp hobby knife to cut that off, and I'll use that flat surface to glue onto one of the sections where I think it might look good. Now it's important not to overload one side if at all possible, just because this will be used for, you know, tabletop wargaming and things like that, and balance is important. Now I've recently undercoated that with a spray primer just to seal any cracks and crevices to stop the silicon molding process from going a little bit too poorly and having the silicon actually wick into it. So I'm just cutting out a box at the moment to put for the mold for the silicon. It's not crucial how big this is, but it does need to be able to cover the entire wall, so it needs to be taller than it, wider than it, and longer than it. It's also important to make sure that the bottom and all the joins are fully sealed. I'm using hot glue because it's nice and solid, and it can be remelted to form a really great seal. It's not important what cardboard or anything you use for the mold, the box. I'm just using a bit of spare model packaging that I had. You could use the cereal box, you could use anything really. If you have a plastic like Tupperware container or something like that, that'd work fine as well. The reason I'm using cardboard is so I can get rid of it afterwards, just in case there's any toxins or anything in the silicon that I don't really want in my food later on. So what I've done now is I've gone over all the edges, on the inside at least, and sealed them all with beads of hot glue. This should stop any leaking. just a quick test to see that everything fits. Yep, awesome. Now the silicon molding stuff I'm using is from PinkySil. I've mixed up a good batch, and I'm now pouring it in really slowly in a nice thin stream to try and stop all the bubbles. I didn't quite pour enough, but that's okay because I'll end up putting some things into the silicon to displace some of it, so that it does end up covering most of the wall. So at the moment I'm just sort of spooning some of the silicon over the sides, or over the top, so that way it gets rid of all the bubbles and things in the top. Now I'm placing some pieces of wood along the sides, again just to displace the silicon and give me a little bit more to work with. This is a great way of saving silicon, because it is expensive, and still getting a great result. So you can see now, just adding those 2 pieces of wood, I've been able to cover up the rest of the wall with silicon. Place one more piece on top, and then weight it down and let it cure. So after demolding, taking the wall out as well as taking it out of the cardboard mold, I place it into a second box that I've made for the resin pour, just in case there's any leaks. So I'm using Easy Cast as well. Now this resin, you need to work fairly quickly, but it is important to mix it very thoroughly, otherwise you're going to have patches that it doesn't quite set properly. Because I've got that small bit there where the tree stump would be, I need to poke some resin down in there to make sure that all the bubbles come out of it. And I just go around most of the mold, making sure that everything sets, and make sure there's no bubbles. I love watching this bit in fast. It's really satisfying. So once that resin is cured, that wasn't real time, by the way, guys. That was over about 20-30 minutes. It's time to demold. So you can see I didn't quite add enough resin that time, but that's okay. Alright, now you do have to be careful not to rip the silicon. That's what you get. Comes out pretty nice, I think. And you can make as many of them as you want. The steady deluge of rain pours over these stone walls, dripping from the dead branches of a twisting tree. As you trudge along the road, a worn milestone pokes out from behind a small tuft of grass. The Baron's Keep is only 3 miles away. A cold breeze blows from ahead, and you steel yourself for whatever may lie before you.